then I shall begin. This is my closing keynote of what's turned out to be a really wonderful, wonderful conference, unbelievably well organized and really exciting. And I decided that I would close with something called the power of personal narrative. And I'm planning to share a couple of stories, and then we will look at them. I'm not going to ask questions. I'm not going to have you respond. I'm just going to talk. I'm sorry, but that's a fact. I'm just going to talk. And if there's room at the end, then we'll chat. But I'm going to start with a story. When I was a kid, setting up the creche in early December was a really big deal. In our family, it was called the crib scene or nativity. Every year, we would lovingly unpack each item and place it in the open wooden shed. Mary, Joseph, the baby Jesus, the manger, the angels, the shepherd, the wise men, sheep, camels, donkeys, cows, dogs, cats, chickens. Everyone was present at the birth of Jesus on the 25th of December in the year 0000. Now, when I was 9, I set out the wooden shed and I unwrapped the nativity pieces, ready to put together the Christmas scene. The previous year, we'd been devastated when we couldn't find the little manger. And I say we, I doubt that anyone cared as much as I did. We had had to use an empty matchbox, one of those little balsa wood ones, purple. And the baby Jesus had nestled in cotton wool quite comfortably until Epiphany on the 6th of January. But now I was horrified to discover that the baby Jesus had disappeared too. I scrabbled through the nativity box, but he wasn't there. Now, the cardboard boxes of decorations were stored in a dark and spooky area known as the little room under the stairs, where murderers could hide, or worse, spiders. So my mum had always had to do the initial schlepping and get the stuff out, so maybe she had lost it. But whoever was responsible, there wasn't much money in our house, so not having a baby Jesus or a manger was a really serious thing. Now, it so happened that the following Saturday morning, I found myself walking around Woolworths on Winchester High Street. I believe that Woolworths in America was the same as Woolworths in England. Long aisles with shop assistants marching up and down like prison guards, keeping an eye on counters that were filled with goodies, everything costing under a shilling, which is less than a quarter, pretty cheap. I wasn't looking for a baby Jesus. I really wasn't. Walking around Woolworths was simply one of my favourite things to do. And my favourite counter was the sweet counter, displaying a diverse selection of loose candy in clear plastic bins. It was a youngster's delight. Anyway, right next to the sweet counter was the little plastic objects counter. Now, if America these days, we're used to seeing made in China written on things. In England, in the 60s, it was made in Hong Kong. Every little plastic object was made in Hong Kong. And all of a sudden, I had magpie syndrome because my eyes were drawn to all of these bright, shiny things. And the one that attracted me most was a brightly coloured, very shiny baby Jesus in a manger. Not just a baby Jesus, not just a manger, but a 2-in-1. I left the sweet counter to look close up. There must have been hundreds of baby Jesuses in the baby Jesus section, all exactly the same. I didn't care. The more the merrier. Let everyone have a shiny plastic made in Hong Kong baby Jesus in a manger. I only wanted one. So I picked up the topmost of these delicate items and I held it very carefully in my little girl hands. The manger was brown and shiny. The straw was yellow and shiny. The baby Jesus was wrapped in swaddling clothes, white and shiny. The King of Kings had an actual face with an actual facial expression. He was lovely and very real. Frankly, he was much nicer than our old baby Jesus, who was tiny and whose face was so small there was no expression, not really any features to speak of. This was a superb piece of craftsmanship. It didn't matter that there were hundreds of them all exactly the same. It was, quite simply, the most beautiful thing that I had ever seen. I turned it over to look at the price. Sixpence, which was half a shilling. That's a good bit less than a quarter. So it was cheap. But when you're 9, it has to be really cheap, and it wasn't cheap enough. I thought about it. Would my mum pay for it? I pictured the scene, Mum in the middle of making dinner. Mummy, you know that we can't find the baby Jesus? Yes, dear.
Yes.
And you know that we've lost the manger as well? I know, dear, it's very sad. And I saw a nice baby Jesus in a manger at Woolworths, Mummy. Not just a baby Jesus, but a baby Jesus in a manger. Will you buy it for us, please? Well, haven't you got any pocket money left, dear? No, Mum, I spent it all on sweets. Well, I'm sorry, love, but I haven't got any money to spare at the moment. But, Mum, it's only sixpence. Well, I'm afraid I haven't got sixpence. Why don't you make one out of a pine cone, darling? I know you can. A pine cone? I didn't think I could. Well, if she wasn't going to pay for it, what was I going to do? I needed the baby Jesus in a manger. We needed the baby Jesus in a manger. I looked at the splendid object in my hand, and that's when I had an idea. A really bad idea. The guard of the shiny plastic objects counter was actually Mrs. Ratty, a neighbour with a long pointed face and little beady eyes, who'd always rather frightened me. Mum said, "How awful to be called Mrs. Ratty when you actually look like a rat." I waited until she reached the end of the counter, and in the split second before she turned round to walk back in my direction, I slipped the beautiful baby into the pocket of my anorak. I stole it! I didn't mean to. It was almost without awareness. My mind had just sort of flickered for a moment, and it was so easy. Immediately, as fast as I pinched it, I wanted to put it back. But Mrs. Ratty turned and looked at me with her beady eyes, so it was too late. The deed was done. I had joined the criminal class. Glancing around to see if anyone had noticed the change in me, I made my way to the exit. Sick to my stomach, I slunk out of the shop. I had never stolen anything before, so you can imagine my sense of guilt. So imagine then that you're Catholic and you've stolen something. The guilt is like a tangible living thing. And now imagine you're Catholic and you've stolen the baby Jesus. The gates to hell might just as well open up and swallow you right there and then. I could see it now. The headlines of the Winchester Catholic Digest. 9-year-old Bernadette Nason of Elm Road, Winchester, was arrested today for stealing a shiny plastic made in Hong Kong baby Jesus in a manger from Woolworths. Peter Paul Bogan, headmaster of St. Peter's Roman Catholic School, is quoted as saying, "She always seemed like such a nice girl. I suppose the devil works in mysterious ways too." I hardly remember the walk home. That blessed infant burned a hole in my pocket. I tried to justify my actions. No one would miss one baby Jesus when there were hundreds of them. I'd be the family hero. Nothing worked. That glittering prize in swaddling clothes was so hot my hand dripped with the sweat of shame. When I got home, I took the offending object out of my pocket and I hung my anorak on the hall stand. Heart thumping, mouth dry, I stood before the family nativity. Despite my horror at what I had just done, I smiled as I placed the stolen merchandise in the middle of the wooden stall so that Mary and Joseph could once again pick up their roles as mother and foster father. Or would it be stepfather? Parents to the Son of God. But there was something I hadn't considered, something that wouldn't have occurred to a child of 9. The shiny plastic made in Hong Kong baby Jesus in a manger was bigger than his parents. This object was massive. I mean, it was at least compared with the Holy Mum and Dad. Our Mary and Joseph were elegant and small. My too hot to handle holy babe was gigantic. It was like setting a monster tractor in a room full of Lamborghinis. Mary and Joseph would have needed a stepladder just to gaze down on him lovingly. Well, I was just beginning to realize the ridiculousness of the situation when my mother walked into the room. I didn't enjoy the walk back to Woolworths. Humble pie with a big dollop of grovelling apology was difficult for me to swallow. I hadn't even had time to appreciate the error of my ways before being caught in the act. There were no criminal repercussions, no shame-filled stories at a later date, until now, anyway, and no punishment that I recall. My mother had her own methods of instilling morals. Her quiet disappointment was almost more than a person could stand. A daily glance at the matchbox with cotton wool and an imaginary baby, which sufficed that year for the glorious newborn, was enough to remind me that stealing baby Jesus wasn't the way to build a crib. It wasn't the way to please my mother. And it certainly wasn't the way to get to heaven. So I'm sure you're all horrified by my behavior. I wrote that story decades ago. And for many years, I never shared it except in conversation, in general, in passing. And the reason for that is I still carried a lot of shame about having stolen something. And of course, this was made much worse by the fact that I had pocketed a baby Jesus. I'm not exaggerating when I stress my fear at being judged for such a terrible, sacrilegious act. It was only when I included that story in a seasonal performance piece that I discovered I wasn't alone in my childhood pilfering. Audience members waited for me after the show so that they could tell me that they had also stolen as children, often explaining the reasons for their theft. I mean, everything from poverty, which was, of course, the most common reason, to seeking attention, from naughtiness to outright insubordination. And this was extraordinarily comforting to me. I mean, it was cathartic, healing. It was almost like therapy because I realized I wasn't alone. And I also realized in return that the sharing of my own personal experience had not only entertained the audience, but it had brought them together, reminding them of their past and, well, I suppose setting up for them that they were not alone also. I mean, perhaps in some cases it gave them a chance to heal. Maybe it even inspired them to share their own stories. How many stories do you avoid because you're ashamed or because you're afraid of being judged? How many of your family stories are still secrets, I wonder? So when I was a kid, my brother would complain to our mother, "Bernie's telling another one of her stories." And my mum would say, "Oh, leave her alone, Dominic. She likes to tell stories." But my school reports would say, Bernadette's grades would improve if she spent less time sharing stories with her friends and more time focused on her classwork. Well, this confused me because I thought stories were what my mother told us at night time. You know, stories like The Wind in the Willows and Alice in Wonderland. I thought the folk tales and fairy tales, the myths and legends that I read in the books on my bedroom shelves were stories. I didn't realize that the funny snippets I told my friends and family were stories. I thought those were anecdotes, just pieces of my life and things that happened in my life. I saw everyday events as being worth imparting, but I wouldn't have called them stories. Well, I wouldn't have called them anecdotes either because I'd never heard that word at the time, but you know what I mean. I was a person to whom things happened. I mean, I might say to a classmate, "What happened to you on the way to school this morning?" And my classmate would probably reply, "Nothing." But if you asked me, I would be able to tell you exactly what happened that morning with the cat vomiting on our new rug and some of the spicy language that my mother came out with. I could tell you what happened with the eccentric old lady at the bus stop shouting at all the children. I might be able to tell you what happened with my shoe when the shoelace broke and then I fell over and I grazed my knees. Now, I'm not telling you that these were riveting stories. It's not fascinating stuff, but I thought it was noteworthy. And one of the things that I loved about it was that I could make my friends laugh. And I love to make people laugh. I like to make them happy. And I suppose you could say then that I was working on personal narratives from a very young age, even if I didn't know it at the time. So I've got to tell you, I can see my big face on the screen right here, and it's very distracting. I just keep saying, I think, oh, put your glasses on straight, put your hair. Okay, sorry, back to the subject. So I'm going to tell you about coming to Texas. I arrived here in 1992, and that's when I began my life as an actor. It had been my dream since I was 11 years old and saw Barbara Streisand in Funny Girl. It just took me a really long time to do it and many misspent years working in offices before I took the Longhorn by the Longhorns. A few years later, I was working at Project Interact. That's Zach Theatre's Theatre for Youth. And I was working with a director who loved to take old folk tales and rewrite them for groups of actors to perform. And so instead of one person, a storyteller, telling, for example, King Midas, there would be four of us, and we would dramatize the story into a little play for kids. Well, this eventually led to my working solo with that same director and acting out all the different characters in programs of folktales. And then we toured Central Texas and the schools and the libraries. So suddenly, from learning to be an actress, I had become a storyteller actress in the mornings. I worked a part-time job in the afternoon, and I was plying my trade as a theatre actress at night. This was all very heady stuff for someone who'd been working in the corporate world. Well, by 1997, with all the experience that I had gathered at Project Interact, I decided to start a one-woman business as a part-time storyteller. And a few years later, I gave up all my daytime work. I still worked in the theatre at night, but this was so I could become a full-time touring storyteller. And I should admit to you at this point, and I know other storytellers have felt the same way, I thought that I had invented one-person storytelling. I thought I was the only storyteller and that I had single-handedly created the career, the job of a touring storyteller, which is embarrassing, I know. And I can imagine you're all saying, well, how arrogant. But truly, I think the appropriate words might, and the kinder words would be misguided, perhaps, naive. Let's be kind here. So during the following years, I developed a series of presentations appropriate for elementary schools. And it was during my working travels that I met and befriended Donna Ingham, who is, of course, a close friend and a storyteller today. And she's my colleague, as well as a really, really good friend. So my first thought when I saw her perform was, another storyteller. And my second thought was, I'm not the only one. And it was Donna who told me about the National Storytelling Conference in Oklahoma City. And that particular year, it was Oklahoma City, and that it would be a gathering place of tellers from all over the country. I could hardly believe it. So in July 2005, I drove to Oklahoma. I still have my program, and it changed my life forever. And what I remember most vividly was that Elizabeth Ellis did a keynote to start the conference, and during which she told a couple of personal stories in the course of her introduction. And I was gobsmacked by this. She was telling stories like the stories that I told as a child, stories about what happened to her and her family, personal narratives that not only entertained, but also shared history and a little bit about her culture, which was until then unfamiliar to me. Her personal narratives were educational to a newbie like me. You see, I didn't know until then that storytellers were allowed to share personal stories on stage. I thought that kind of storytelling was reserved for performances at fringe festivals. At least that's where I had been doing my 15 to 20-minute anecdotal pieces about living in England and Dubai and Libya, and my fish out of water stories about coming to America. So here, I was watching one of the country's most renowned storytellers doing what I hadn't known was possible, allowable. So I immediately signed up for 2 workshops at the Oklahoma conference that addressed the process of personal storytelling. One was with Michael Cotter, and the other was with Jim May. And they were eye-opening and awe-inspiring, and I still have the notes that I typed up from that day. I was like a child who had been given free rein in a toy shop. All the toys could be mine, and there was no turning back. So on the way home from Oklahoma City to Austin, I drove in my car and followed Donna Ingham and Mary Grace Kettner in their car. I had checked my map, my actual map, because I didn't have a cell phone in those days, and I had a good idea of which major roads to follow. But I felt extra secure being behind these 2 well-traveled tellers. And I could see their heads deep in conversation, obviously discussing the conference. I didn't have anyone to talk to in my car, but I switched off my CD and I began thinking. I do my best thinking on long car trips. And I was trying to work out why I was so completely bowled over by the discovery that personal stories could be told on stage. Why, I kept asking myself, why does this matter so much to me? And this thought was followed by, why do I like telling stories in the first place? Why do I like listening to stories? And I began making a mental list. And the final list is what I hope you've got as a handout. It should be somewhere in a folder somewhere. And it's my list of, why do we tell stories? Well, The first one on that list was entertaining, and I knew that I love to entertain, I love to make people laugh, but I began to note all the other reasons. I'm guessing that you could go onto the internet today and you could ask AI and it would come up in an instant. Why do we tell stories? But for me, it was a painstaking exercise, and the list grew each time I heard someone else's personal story and recognized what I was getting from it. Well, now I was driving behind Donna, as I said, and all of a sudden her car veered to the right and onto a road which was not on my written travel plan. She had definitely taken a wrong turn, and I had no choice but to follow her car. And when I caught up with it, I flashed my lights over and over again. No phone, remember, until finally they pulled over into a lay-by. And I got out and walked over. I think they thought that my car had broken down. And I want you to note the irony that this is an English woman driving back from Oklahoma to Texas, telling a couple of Texas storytellers that they had gone off track. And when they realized I was right, they laughed and laughed because they had been so busy chatting, they hadn't been watching the road. And so we all laughed because this is part of the adventure of being a touring storyteller, an occupational hazard. And as you see, I am sharing the personal narrative some 20 years later. Well, over the next couple of years, I attended the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro to watch and listen the best of the best. I was altogether captivated by everyone I heard, but I'll mention just a few of my favorites. They'll be familiar to some of you because these people were instrumental in helping me develop my list of why people tell stories in the first place. And the first one was Catherine Wyndham. And her stories were filled with this important and heartbreaking American history. That's what really resonated with me. And then Bill Harley's set showed his very amusing take, his perspective on American life, and he sang songs too. Kevin Clayton taught me hilariously about baseball. Ed Stuyvesant shared a story about Catholicism, which rang so true in my mind that I was suddenly reeling as stories about my own Catholic upbringing came swirling into my head. And I'm going to share a very short one of those stories now. I come from a family of remedial Catholics. My mother became Catholic to marry my father. Being the daughter of a Church of England vicar, this caused such a stink in her family that she was disinherited. When my father gave her 3 lovely children under the age of 4 and ran off with a lady called Auntie Betty, my mother lost her new faith. But she had made the promise to bring up her children as Catholic, and as an honest, principled woman, this she did. Now, despite my father's naughty behavior, he was a devout Catholic. He honestly believed that being a Catholic meant he was already saved. It didn't matter what he did, there was already a place for him in heaven. As long as he went to confession and mass regularly, he could blow up your car with a clear conscience because, you see, God would understand. So my father thought that with his place in heaven secure, anyone outside the Catholic faith was in trouble. The way he saw it, if Gandhi himself were at the pearly gates, St. Peter would look at his clipboard and he would say, "Well, Mr. Gandhi, I see from me notes here that you've been a pretty okay sort of a bloke and I'd like to help you out, but you're not Catholic. Oh, I know. You've been wonderful with your non-violent peace. It's admirable and we're all grateful, but have you ever said a rosary? Did you ever go to confession? I mean, according to me paperwork, you've not even been to bingo. I'm sorry, miss. Yeah, my hands are tied. But there's Geoffrey George Nason. How the devil are you? Step aside, Mr. Gandy. Come on, Mr. Nason. Come and make yourself at home. Mother Teresa's pouring you a Guinness at the bar right now. See, this is how I always pictured my father seeing his place in heaven. And he was a big believer in confessing your sins. And when we were little, my sister Verity and I struggled with the whole concept of confession. Our conversation will be something like this. So you do something wrong, and then you go to a priest who disapproves of everything in the universe, and you tell him what you've done so that he can humiliate and punish you. I know. And God knows everything anyway, doesn't he? He does. He's omnipotent. He's omnipotent. He knows everything. And another thing, he created us. And so he knows what we're like. He knows what we like. He knows what we've done. And he knows we're going to do it again. And then we'll go to confession. See, we were very confused about the whole concept. So in our house, Saturday meant confession. And I used to commit the same sins so often, I knew my list off by heart. I could get in and out of the confessional box in 2 minutes flat with a don't do it again and 3 Hail Marys. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's a week since I've been to confession, and since then I have lied, cheated, stolen, cussed, preened, bragged, envied, flirted, cheeked my mother, bullied my sister, teased my brother. I'm very sorry. I won't do it again. 3 Hail Marys? I know. I look back on it now and I'm embarrassed, but there you are. It's a fact. Now, if Saturday meant confession, Sunday meant Mass. From the youngest age, St. Peter's Roman Catholic Church, every Sunday morning. Mum, my elder brother Dominic, Verity, and me. As young teenagers, we began to go to the 7 o'clock evening Mass because, like most teenagers, we couldn't get up in the morning. At this point, we made our own way to church. My sister and I walked there together, and we sat near the front. My brother would leave his ghastly teenage friends doing whatever ghastly teenage boys do, and he would take his seat on the far left of the church, and my mother would stand at the back because she was claustrophobic. This went on for years. By now, Sunday evening Mass had become rather popular and was so packed that sitting near the altar meant that our brother couldn't see us, and our mother couldn't see us. And one day, when Verity was 15 and I was 16, we worked out that if no one could see us, no one would know if we were there or not. As long as we set out for church at 6:30 and were home by 8:30, that 2-hour stretch was ours. Now, what would interest 2 teenage girls playing hooky from church? In the early 1970s, life was quite simple. We were interested in boys and music. And where could one go on a Sunday night in the ancient city of Winchester to find boys and music in the same place? My sister and I found ourselves at the Old Vine Inn, a lively, smoky, boozy pub overlooking the grounds of Winchester Cathedral at the Dave Dingo Disco Show. Now, you mustn't misunderstand. We didn't drink, we didn't smoke, we didn't take drugs. We just went to the pub. The rules are different in England. At 16, a person is allowed to go to a pub as long as they're with a responsible person over 18. Well, lots of the Old Vine regulars were friends of ours, most of them over 18. I don't know that they were particularly responsible, but I didn't care about that. Dave Dingo pulled in the crowds because he had very eclectic taste in music, mostly American. But more importantly, performing alongside him, he had go-go dancers. And my sister and I would drink our grapefruit juice and watch the men watching the go-go dancers, because this was much more interesting to us than watching the go-go dancers themselves, who were often local townspeople that we recognised. Winchester is not the sort of town where the go-go dancers took their clothes off, rest assured, which is just as well, since the most hardened stomach would have curdled at the sight of the old lady from the fish shop in any state of undress. Anyway, apart from the go-go dancers, there was one more really exciting thing about the Dave Dingo Disco Show, and that was the Dave Dingo Disco Quiz. And the reason we loved it is that we were really good at it. My sister and I were mad about American music, particularly Motown and soul music, so we could answer really obscure questions, which meant that we kept winning prizes in the Dave Dingo Disco Quiz, which were difficult to explain when we were supposed to have been in church. It wasn't a problem at first, a key ring here, a ballpoint pen there. But the more difficult the question, the bigger the prize. And some nights we won so much stuff we could hardly carry it. We were sure that we were done for. One night, Mum caught us red-handed, prizes hidden behind our back. Only my quick thinking and my amazing teenage ability to lie without compunction saved us. And for some reason that we couldn't explain, Mum believed me when I told her that Father Malarkey had given me, for naming the Stations of the Cross, a long-playing record called Rock and Roll Explosion, and my sister for listing the books of the Old Testament, a large box of King Edward's cigars. If we had been older, and perhaps less guilt-ridden, maybe we would have questioned the likelihood of our mothers accepting our explanation, but we were so relieved to get away with it, we didn't question anything. At Sunday lunch the next week, completely out of the blue, Mum declared that she would no longer attend the Catholic Church and that she was going back to her Anglican roots and the local Church of England church, and that we were now old enough to make our own choices on the subject. My sister and I were gobsmacked. What if she was angry with Father Malarkey for giving us such inappropriate gifts? What if she decided to have a word with him? Either way, in one fell swoop, she had completely destroyed any interest we had in going to the Dave Dingo Disco Show. Not just because we feared she'd talk to the priest, but also because the thrill of deception was gone. We never went again. Years later, in telling family stories at the lunch table, we found out none of us was going to church at that time. While my sister and I were dazzling the pub with our pop culture knowledge, my brother was playing soccer in the park, and Mum, who was reclaiming her spirituality, read a book in the cathedral grounds, ironically, in full view of the old Vine Inn. Now, can we talk about family secrets? Because this was a secret, and it came out discussing around the table, sharing stories around the table, that none of us was actually going to church. What have you found out about your parents late in life when the secrets have been told? What family stories have you told where you suddenly realize that the person across the table from you did not know that story? This is why we share personal narratives, different points of view within a group. I mean, did any of you play hooky from church? What music? No, I see people shaking their heads. We all found out our churches later, but at this point, this was it for us. What music were you listening to as a teenager? Well, the following years at the Jonesborough Festival, I listened to Tim Tingle. and I heard him talk about his Cherokee tales, highlighting the Trail of Tears, and Donna Ingham and DC Cornish, who told anecdotes about their lives in Texas. Such diverse experiences. And they were all an inspiration to me. But then Donald Davis, he told personal narratives that resonated in a big way because he took us back to his childhood and growing up in North Carolina. And he told the story about wandering off as a child and causing his mother terrible worry when he didn't come home at the expected time. And at that moment, I was transported to my own childhood on an occasion where I had done the same thing to my mother. And I was encouraged to put that story on paper and later to tell it. And because I want to make sure that I come in on time, I'll tell that story just in a nutshell. I was in love with Paul McCartney. I just adored Paul McCartney. And my mother took us all to see the film A Hard Day's Night when we were children. I mean, it was quite a thing because we were all very little kids. And obviously, she must really have wanted to go and see that movie because seriously, taking three small children to see a Beatles movie, that must have been something. We were very much behind the times in our household. We didn't have a telephone. We had just a broken down old TV, a black and white one with just two channels. We did have a record player in a console, and we had a reel-to-reel tape recorder where we recorded music, and the music that we liked to record most was the Beatles. And it's hard to believe that there are people who may not know who the Beatles are. But when the new movie, the Beatles movie Help came out, I really wanted to go and see it. My mum said she would take us. And then eventually it didn't look like it was going to happen. And I whined and complained. And she found some neighbors who said they would take me. It was a Saturday in August 1965 at the Winchester Odeon Cinema. I was beside myself with excitement. I'd got the money in my hand. And it turned out this family couldn't go because one of the children had German measles. And so I didn't know what to do. I was so desperate to see the movie. I was very young, and I decided I would go on my own. And I had the money, I'd wearing a little cotton frock. It was such a lovely day. And I just decided I would take myself to the cinema. So I walked all the way. I knew where it was. It was a couple of miles probably. I was incredibly excited. I got little plastic shoes on and my little cotton frock. I don't know how I managed to get past the lady on the door. I don't even know if I actually paid. But either way, I found myself sitting at the tender age of 8, all on my own in the cinema watching Help. It's a terrible movie. At the time, I thought it was the most wonderful thing I'd ever seen, but it's pretty terrible. And I knew already by the time I'd finished watching it that I wanted to see it again. And I thought how incredibly exciting, very illegal, I was sure. But as long as I didn't leave my seat, I was so decadent. I was going to see a movie twice through. And I just stayed in my seat. And when the people started coming in for the second showing, there I was. I didn't enjoy the second showing as much. I think I was a little bit guilty at not having left when I was supposed to. The cinema had got very cold, so I was shivering. At some point towards the end of the film, the usherettes had come round with their flashlights, shining them in the seats. And I don't know why, but I ducked down out of sight. I think I was afraid that I had actually broken the law by staying to see it a second time. But when the movie ended and I came outside, the weather had changed. It was really pouring with rain. And all I could think was, I wanted to get home. I wanted to get home and see my mother. But by the time I reached the railway station, and I was crying by this time, I looked up at the clock and I saw that it was 8 p.m. And that meant that I had been gone from home for 5 hours. And as I walked through the railway station, under the bridge to the railway station, I saw a familiar figure walking towards me. and it was my mummy. And I just ran in her direction, my plastic shoes squelching with each step. I was so pleased to see her. I burst into tears all over again. And as I got close, I saw that she was carrying my multi-patterned anorak over her arm, and clutched against her chest with her other arm was a photo frame. The instant she saw me, she began to run too. And the next part's a bit vague, but it seemed to me that in a flurry of motion, she hugged me tightly, took in that I was okay, said, "Where on earth have you been?" and then slapped me hard on the back of my legs. I was very confused. I think that's called mixed messages. But she was on the way to the police station to report me missing. When I hadn't arrived home by 6:30, she'd walked up to the road to the neighbor's house, and they said they sent me home because of the German measles. And so my mum had called the police station, I mean the cinema, and they had looked for me. That was the flashlight going around. They hadn't seen a child, and so my mother was on her way to the police station. I I cried all the way home with my mother clutching my hand. My legs were still smarting from the slap. And when I walked in the house, my brother and sister were sobbing on the sofa, which was an anomaly in itself because they wouldn't normally have touched each other with a barge pole. They were both boo-hooing like crazy. And that was the last memory I had of this, my siblings crying on the sofa. Any repercussions have faded with the passage of time. I'm sure there were some. My sister said later that Mum left the house with the photo and my coat, and she told them to get down on their knees and pray for my safety. "Did you?" I asked. "Oh, yes," my sister said. "We couldn't think of anything else to do." Thanks. Well, when I was older, Mum sat me down and she explained the horror of a missing child, that nothing compares with the panic a mother feels when her child doesn't return home as expected. She said it felt as if her whole world was coming to an end before her eyes, like someone was ripping her heart out of her chest. And I said jokingly that she obviously loved me more than I loved Paul McCartney. And we both laughed and laughed because that's the way we handled emotion in our house. And I wonder how that story makes you feel. Were you picturing how your mother would react under similar circumstances? Were you remembering a time when you did something a little bit silly that caused your parents to worry about you? Or was it one of your siblings who created some sort of panic within the house? Perhaps you're a parent yourself, and you are remembering an occasion when your child didn't return at a normal time. I mean, this is what personal narratives do. They give you the opportunity to think of occasions where maybe you've been through the same thing, and stories that you can share that pass on a lesson, perhaps. And now I'm going to close with one story, with a final little story. And one of my favorite storytellers told me this piece, and I'm going to share it today with the disclaimer that she said she heard it from one of her favorite storytellers 25 years ago. And I like the fact that this is a folk tale with a crossover into personal narrative, because it's a very powerful depiction of the power of personal narrative. And whenever I think of that, this is the story that comes to mind. I've been wanting to tell it for years, but I've never found out whose story it actually is, because I went to the favorite storyteller of my favorite storyteller, and he said it wasn't his story. He had never told it. And he said, "It sounds like a great story. You should tell it." And I thought, okay, but I still don't actually know whose story it is. So this is this tiny story that I have developed, and I've called it The Unexplained War. Once upon a time, there were two countries that rested adjacent to one another along a border between the two. And these two countries had been at war for as long as anyone could remember. What no one could remember so late in the game was why they were at war. And what I mean by that is no one alive had any knowledge of how or why the war started. Hundreds of years had passed and hundreds of battles had taken place along the border, but no one knew the reason. At the head of these two countries were rich and powerful kings who hated one another. Their fathers hated one another, their grandfathers, great-grandfathers, they all hated one another. Whole families hated each other, going back hundreds of years. At some point, one must assume, there was an argument or a disagreement, perhaps about land or property. Maybe somewhere along the line, insults had been exchanged. In our social media area of social, we are aware of how quickly things can escalate, but this was hundreds of years ago. So it wouldn't have been quite so immediate, but word of mouth mattered. Word of mouth traveled. Maybe insults got exchanged. Rumors came from stories repeated, ruined reputations, fights, wars. And whatever it was that started the animosity between these two countries was now ancient history. There came a time, though, when it was agreed that a battle to end all battles would take place between these two countries because the war needed to end. The kings themselves would be at the head of these armies. Whichever king won the battle would take over the other king's country. This was the only way to bring the war to a close. The battle took place, and it ended only when there were no soldiers left to fight. The only men remaining were the kings themselves. It was late in the day, and they stood, proud and resolute, beneath a tree that grew on the borderline between their respective countries. But they couldn't fight. They wanted to, but they couldn't because neither had any strength left after their strenuous days of conflict. They stared at each other, dog-tired, too exhausted to move, and they agreed that they would rest beneath the tree until morning, at which point they would fight, hand-to-hand combat, to the death. May the best man win. They sank to their knees and turned their shattered bodies to lean against the tree, in the hope that they would be protected, each from the other, by their royal honour during this moment of vulnerable rest. Subconsciously, both men had become aware of something that you and I might have seen immediately, that the sworn enemy before him was similar in height and build and age. These kings were young men, both having taken over from their country's throne from their fathers before them. But they had never met before. Both held an age-old aggression inside him, but upon seeing the enemy face to face, something changed. A little of that ancient, deep-rooted aggression diminished. At first, they rested in silence, each trying to regain enough strength to take on the final battle in the morning. But as the minutes and then the hours passed by, they began to talk. Slowly at first, but each taking his turn to talk about his life, about his father, about his wife and children, uncles and aunts, about the people they loved and respected, about their loyal subjects and how important it was to take the imperial position, how seriously they needed to take their job as king. As they rested, they talked about the beauty of the countryside and the lands they ruled. They told tale after tale about childhood, growing up, taking on more responsibility, and learning the ways of their people. The more they talked, the more they realized they had in common, more than they could possibly have imagined. In fact, they agreed their upbringing and family histories were so similar, it's almost as if they were brothers. Their experiences, in many cases, identical. They slept a little, leaning back against the tree, heads nodding and rolling. And when they awoke, it was getting light, and the morning sun in all its glory was beginning to rise on the new day. The kings stood slowly, still weary and aching from the excesses of the days before, but perhaps strong enough to fight this final battle to the death. But a change had taken place. They had discussed their families and spoken of their lives. They had become aware of their similarities and what they had in common. They turned and looked each other in the eye, two men whose families had been warring for centuries, and they knew that the war was over. For they knew they could not fight, because each had told the other his story. And you cannot fight a person once you have heard that person's story. The two kings shook hands beneath the tree and made a plan to meet again in peace. The battle had been won by both of them. And I see from the chat you're talking about Dan Kedding, and Dan Kedding is the one who said, I never told that story, but we'll get to that in just a moment. That story is not a personal narrative in itself, but closes with a perfect example of the power of personal narrative. And I'm glad that you said Dan Kedding, because I can say he is that storyteller. And I'm going to close today with a quote from Oprah Winfrey to an audience at Harvard University. It's a very short quote. This is it, quote, I heard it from President Bush. I heard it from Barack Obama. I've heard it from heroes and housewives, victims and perpetrators of crimes. I even heard it from Beyonce in all her Beyonce-ness. She finishes performing, hands me the microphone, and she says, was that okay? Friends and family, mine, yours, enemies, strangers, in every argument, every encounter, every exchange, I will tell you, they all want to know one thing. Was that okay? Did you hear me? Do you see me? Did what I say mean anything to you? And even though this is the college where Facebook was born, my hope is that you will try to go out and have more face-to-face conversations with people you may disagree with, that you'll have the courage to look them in the eye and hear their point of view, and help make sure that the speed and distance and anonymity of our world doesn't cause us to lose our ability to stand in someone else's shoes and recognize that we share all we share as people. Unquote. Thank you so much for listening today. I feel like I've talked for an hour, and by God, I have. Thank you so much. And now let's open it up and let everybody talk.